we're in Mark's capable hands now. He has sent through some questions, which I will paste into the chat now. And the floor is all yours, Mark.
Wow. Well, thanks indeed. I'm coming from Tonga country in the people of the mists and the waters of the Goulburn Valley, so central Victoria, and the territory runs really from the outskirts of Naarm, Melbourne, right up to the high country in the northeast. So I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And again, thank you to everybody for the opportunity. It's more than a little daunting to be presenting on something that just about all of you know plenty of and live at some stage, but there's also this astonishing intellectual firepower. So I will, as it were, just throw a few logs and hope someone can get the fire started. One of my particular interests, which I characterise, if you like, is the place of the artist in society, in contemporary Australian society. I characterise as a sort of tension between artistic exceptionalism and artistic particularism. And by that I mean that if you look at our laws, and I'm a lawyer for those of you who don't know me, you can just paint me with that brush. If you look at the laws, there are various places where the artist and the role of the artist is an exception to the norm. There are freedoms, if you like, that are not given to ordinary people. But in tension with that is the other question about whether artists in the romantic sense are mad, bad, dangerous to know, or whether in fact they are, and this is what I call artistic particularism, exemplary members of a society. And they are both the conscience, the thinkers, the moral arbiters, if you like, and certainly moral exemplars. And I think there's some very interesting tensions which I've been trying to unpack for a number of years and raise with students and anyone else who'll listen. So when I wrote platform paper number 56, which was called Falling Through the Gaps, Our Artists' Health and Welfare in 2018, the aim at that stage was simply to call attention to the 60th anniversary of the Victorian Actors Benevolent Trust, and I've been on that board for a while, and to use this in connection with some very fine labour and independent MHRs, particularly Helen Haynes, who was MHR for Indi, where I'm sitting at the moment, to try to put together a parliamentary friends group for the performing arts and those who work in it. We had a week lobbying in Canberra in 2018, in August. We went to question time on the Wednesday, and we saw Malcolm Turnbull answer 3 consecutive questions on the coalition energy policy in 3 slightly different ways. And if you've ever been in the Strangers Gallery, you'll know you look straight across the mosh pit of the House of Reps, straight at the press gallery. And on the 3rd answer, the press gallery's shoulders relaxed. They hit their notepads, they had their story, or thought they had. The next day, Malcolm Turnbull was replaced by his party with Scott Morrison. In that time, we probably did 30 interviews with Greens, with senators, with Labor shadows, with members, and with independents. The most we got of the 30 or 40 interviews was one staffer from Mitch Firefield's office for about 30 seconds for a cup of coffee, and he took the platform paper with a furtive look on his face. Audience at that stage, and I had pulled all the strings I could, was impossible. And that was in 2018. Now, a quick augmentation to my biography. I've been on the committee of the VABT for the five years, and we're still, since mid-2020, we've been running, in effect, a COVID soup kitchen. We're delivering food vouchers out to people who are pretty much in crisis and haven't worked for well over a year, particularly in Victoria. We joined with the New Zealand and the other state benevolent trusts last year in a COVID response to form the alphabet soup, which is now known as the AABF, the Australasian Alliance of Performing Arts Benevolent Funds. Kate Blanchett's the patron, and she's given both material and reputational support to the crisis. And in addition to that, we've moved to virtual bucket rattles and an online October campaign, which is going to occur again in October, preferably when the theatres have reopened, as they have now in Victoria, in a physical space as well. Now, broadly speaking, the benevolent funds have been assisting during COVID with the constituency most people would know about, those towards the end of career or who've fallen on hardship. But there are also two new categories, and we're really tapping for the first time, I think, in years into these. The freelancers, including the crew members, many of whom have been in show business all their lives. I mean, and the top rank, international and national. And the second category has been the graduating performing arts students who've just had the first 2 years of their professional lives blighted. And I should add that all these categories include non-Australian residents who, unlike most of the rest of the global north, didn't qualify for Australian assistance through JobSeeker or JobKeeper. Australians, for example, in Germany, no questions asked, they immediately received a living wage through the German welfare system, and it was the same in France and a number of other countries. A second role I've got is as a board member of Polyglot Theatre, which has child-created experience at its core, but which is international in outlook and, needless to say, has been unable to engage in about 60% of its former activity of international touring. At the moment, they have gone back to a large extent into theatre and education. They'd hate to call it that, but there is an element of that. Sue Giles wrote the platform paper number 55 just before mine about child experience. But another feature is that in 2019, it lost its recurrent funding from Australia Council. As a result, there are, I think, only 2 child-centred companies left receiving Australia Council funding, where 5 years ago there were 11. So there's some pretty dire things happening with our future audiences and future theatre makers as well. So to use the joke regularly used about actors, that's enough about me. Now let's talk about me. My actual task as a lawyer of earning my own kind of living is more prosaic. I've tried to spend as much time as I could since I earned half a living as an actor 35 years ago, trying to ensure both that creativity is valued and captured, dread word, but that as much as possible of that capture goes to the right places. In that sense, a universal basic income for people who work in the arts has to be predicated on an assessment both of the status of the artist in society, the exceptionalism bit, and where there are specific failures or gaps that need to be singled out and fixed, if you like, the economics of artistic particularism. And this brings me back to 3 streams in my professional universe, which is largely in the private sector, along with the charitable and not-for-profit sector, and to a certain extent in academia, and also charitable work, the charitable sector being huge, as we've heard before. So part of my universe is making sure that people receive fair fees for the work that they do, trying to ensure that lasting work receives what I'll call long tail income, and dealing with the many who fall through the gaps of the gaps where there should be support, both material and psychic. So to start in particular with long tail income, I often refer to a study that was commissioned by Cutler and Company in the Keating government back in 1992, Creativity and Commerce. This was at the point where the internet was about to be a thing, and there was real doubt in terms of cultural policy as to whether we were just going to get 400 channels of replays of I Love Lucy, or Australia was going to be able to tap into a wider market for the special things that Australian artistic talent could offer. One of the things that Cutler, who subsequently went on to be chair of the Australia Council, pointed out was that if you look at any economy in the cultural area, these vast profits go to the people who own, if you like, the distribution networks. And that at most 15% of the 100 cents in the dollar, and more likely somewhere between 2 and 3%, will go to the creators at the beginning of the chain. By far and away, 50 or 60% will go to the distribution channels, the theatres, the ticket sellers, the producers. And those percentages just don't seem to me to change as a practicing lawyer. What has changed, however, in the last 30 years, 35 years, is that the price that people are prepared to pay for cultural product, or that the distributors are prepared to extract for cultural product, has shrunk vanishingly. The liveness of the live theatre has been one of those ones that's held up, and we've actually seen the big distribution chains, the Disneys, the motion picture spin-offs come into the live theatre, because live is still where you can put a fence around things and charge people for entry. And that's true also of the music industry, that people have had to get back onto their out and tour because there's been no money coming in from recording. Another aspect of long tail income is the idea of repertoire. And it struck me always that the Australia Council never credited or funded revivals, so they just didn't happen. Instead, we got for a number of decades a long stream of short-run world premieres. As far as I can see, the only thing that did surprisingly work out of this policy was the contribution to the wider culture of a few successes. Hotel Sorrento, for example, and Cosy have been performed somewhere in Australia at an amateur level for 20 years, every week of the year. In terms of Australia's international performance in performing culture, Joanna Murray-Smith and Daniel Keane continue to receive royalties from all over the world, including the non-English speaking ones. But the point that was made earlier on this morning is that the creators of the performances, the actors, the dramaturgs, directors, and many other contributors, receive only their fees for the original runs. At the same time, elsewhere all over the world, there are new actors, new dramaturgs, directors, etc., earning a living from those professional productions. They at least get a gig. So the total economy of the successful cultural play, for want of a better word, shifts offshore, or shifts somewhere else into the amateur sector and away from the professional sector that created it in the first place. So in my view, that the development of long tail income ought also to recognise this long tail of recognition of the intangible but economically measurable factors, which include such facts as the artists and the works are, in many of the best cases, going to be well ahead of the popular zeitgeist, in some cases by generations. And that's why we have a copyright term that lasts for the life of the author plus 70 years to compensate the grandchildren for the disastrous choice of someone to become an actor rather than a banker or a stockbroker. The fact that we are have indigenous recognition by the wider society. In that case, the culture of millennia has taken 2 centuries to move to the foremost part of Australian cultural consciousness, if it is there yet, and some people would doubt that. Depends where you are in the cycle. We've also going to have a long tail with the societal recognition of new communities, whether they are the emerging migrant community or communities of if you like, settler Australians, or minority or other, which are each claiming recognition with increasing velocity and each have their own completely justifiable moral and economic needs for legitimacy. And then we also are stuck at the moment, particularly with the legal right, in a creator-centric method of reward that targets individuals and certainly not groups, collectives, or for that matter, communities. And on top of all of this, there's the psychic problem of failure. Failure can occur at any time in any career. You can have won every Helpman Award. You can be nominated for international awards. You can be in some fantastic piece of long-lasting cultural product, and then the phone will not ring. And the psychological damage that can do, the pushing into substance abuse, and all the other accidents that happen in life when we have a profession, particularly in the performing arts, that favours youth. And so there is always someone, and this was actually said by Disney management to a cast of one of the musicals, we can always get someone else. You're not allowed to have a bad time ever, or a bad patch. So coming out of what we've been talking about today and yesterday is that actors are the original members of the gig economy. They have always been part of, and that's not going to change. It's a very geographically mobile demographic. That's not even year by year or the average 2 years that US people live in any one house, but it's week by week. So there are long-term problems for security of housing, security of relationship, and security of community. There's the natural generosity of artists, which I'm afraid plays against them very regularly. They do put in because they make people feel good. And in that economy of generosity, one gets that psychic satisfaction back again. But it's not enough to keep one fed, certainly not in the long term. And then there's this other Australian reluctance to cuddle up to what Walter Bagot, the original editor of The Economist, called the symbolic form of government. Certainly since the Keating period, artists have no relation either to the efficient forms of government, cabinet ministers or their advisors. They don't get photographed with any of those folks. But they're not even related now to the symbolic ones, the old symbols, if you like, of the state and the comfortable sense of being within a political community, the monarch, the governors general, even our elders, whoever everyone accepts as their elders right now. So the more I look at the English-speaking models for support of artistic careers and remuneration, the more I see the failure that occurred by politicising culture. There's considerable blame on all sides of politics, and some have to be levelled at artists themselves who are at their wits' end and have been at their wits' end as this has gone on around them. But let's not forget that culture has the same element of mystique that politics has. Artistic constitutions share many of the categories of political ones. There has to be a broad buy-in. Without it, any guarantee of support for artistic careers from the state or any arm's length agency is doomed to fail. So finally, I'll give you a few words from Rupert Meyer's discussion on a pathway to the rights status of the artist legislation, which he gave just after he stepped down as chair of OSCO at the Melbourne launch of my platform paper, and just after George Brandis had shafted the Australia Council with Catalyst. He commented, this is Rupert Meyer, commented that though his visual arts and crafts inquiry had concluded status of the artist legislation was a step too far at that stage, by 2018 he was persuaded that it was probably time to revisit the issue. But he made the following comments on policy development. It's necessary to be very clear-headed about exactly what is being sought from government, he said. In 2002, there was unambiguous recommendation in support for a resale royalty for visual artists, not a recommendation for further review. Pleasingly, the government supported the recommendations and it was introduced. In the period since it was introduced, more than 1,600 artists have shared in over 6.3 million in distributions, and that's risen since then. With regard to the proposals outlined, the next stage is to process the development of specific policy proposals, and this is the important takeaway from Rupert's comments, that they have the following three characteristics. First, that they are fensible, as he put it, that they can be clearly defined. Defensible, that there is a powerful public good argument. And implementable. And Rupert went on to say, I believe that it would be timely to do so. Well, that's 3 years ago, and I know David Pledger has been doing a lot of work on this, and he's more qualified to talk about perhaps the contemporary debate. But I just wanted to step back and think a little more. So we have the adage, we all know that society's 5 square meals away from chaos. It's not a first world problem. It's certainly technically not a problem for our Australian society, contemporary Australian society in the broad, but it's ever present in certain communities of depression. We've seen the society, particularly after 110 odd days of lockdown in Melbourne, that the society is very resilient. But tell that to the 2,000 odd people who were truly locked down Wuhan style in the North Melbourne Housing Commission flats last year, or as we're seeing the bewildered residents of Sydney's southwest municipalities who suddenly had 100 extra police fastened on them. So many people who work in the arts want to explore these other narratives in our society, the people who fall between structural gaps. So the predicament, as I see it, is simply the old adage, ars longa vita brevis, that the psychic satisfaction of working in the arts does not need to be matched with material riches, but basic needs of artistic citizens that are not served by contemporary economics, tax breaks, the welfare system, and a number of other factors that I've addressed elsewhere do need addressing. But first, we need, thanks to the format of this seminar, to consider some questions. And thanks again for the opportunity, Harriet, Julian, and Ian, to pose some. So what are the 3 questions? Once the chiarivari, to use John Rose's term from yesterday, or I might use the word skimmington, which is a more English term, once all of that noise and clamour that people deserve to make dies away, or it has the effect of calling attention to the political predicament, we've actually got to settle down and do the hard yards on where is the healing and rejoining of culture and cultural practitioners to the whole of the wider polity. What are we aiming for? How are we going to do it? And then practically, as part of this, and this is part of the problem, one of the problems I see of status of the artist legislation, is who can possibly determine who is a professional artist? When does one start becoming a professional artist? Does one ever stop being a professional artist? Third question, what mechanisms can adjust for the specific otherness of the artistic life in contemporary Australian society? And I mean by that, the structural otherness of just the way you learn your craft and maintain it. Economically, the way you get paid, including long tail income. And in terms of career satisfaction and recognition. And we've got to do that relative to and sensitive to the predicament of so many others in Australian society. So those are my challenges, and I think I've just gone in a little over time. I apologise for that. I think it came in at about 20 minutes. Anyway, over to you.
That's perfect. So we've got those questions. People should have them in the chat. If not, go and have a look and cut them. I don't know whether the chat survives in the different in the different chat rooms, but if we can go to the chat rooms now, Bella, and we'll. Room 1, who would like to share?
I'll just quickly go through, and I freely admit that when we ask the question, well, you know, what would a universal basic income look like? I'm afraid we skidded off that very fast into getting back to this political square one. I'm arguing needs to be addressed, and I suppose the biggest elephant in the room that we were all talking about is just the lack of any kind of peak body or any kind of national leadership at the moment. And that without that, we are going to be in considerable difficulty.
Lack of peak body or national leadership from our perspective out.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Should we leave it at that and go to the other rooms? Room 2, that was our room. Who'd like to summarise where we got to? Or we spoke a fair bit about, I think similarly, Mark, talking about advocacy and thinking through lack of overall strategy when it comes to working these things. So we considered, you know, to which level of government should representations be made? That was one notion that came up. Whether there's value in, you know, assertively pitching towards local and state governments rather than to federal governments for support of the arts. There was also, you know, we canvassed a range of approaches, whether the example was given of Brian Brown recently advocating directly to Scott Morrison and mobilising that sort of capacity. We reflected a little bit on the recent experience of the Arts Party trying to engage in political process at the last federal election, and a kind of concern expressed that project wasn't mounted on the back of a kind of groundswell movement, either not even beyond the arts community, but within the arts community as well, and thinking what kind of strategic alliances could be forged with other kinds of workers. So the point was made that one area within the arts, the broader sector in which there have been massive disruption and job losses recently, has been with journalism and you know, those industries, and in which ways can we go about forming hegemonic blocks with those kind of partners, so that the advocacy isn't simply for the arts, but for a broader sense of value and purpose across a broader spectrum of work. Anything else from us, David, Stephen? And Nick, yeah.
Nick, you're on mute, Dom. You're on mute. Still on mute. Also,
No, I was just saying we did talk about the French and the Belgian model of
Oh, that's true.
artist income.
Yep. So we canvass a couple of other models in which there are, depreciation schedules for artists.
Yeah.
Different.
The point being, I suppose, that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. It has been thought about before by other.
And that's actually what drove us to the question of, well, how do we lobby for that? Who do we take such ideas to? Okay, room 3.
Yes, I'm speaking on behalf of the group. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep, okay. We talked about defining the artist first in terms of, is it you making a living or is it just you in the act of saying it? And can you verify that? Alison raised the issue of First Nations people. If you ask who's the best song person or the best dancer, people will direct you to that person. And Alison reminded us that that was part of the setting up of the Australia Council, after all, with peer assessment. Sorry, attribution. Yeah, and Julian spoke about quite eloquently and personally about the challenges to being an artist, and especially that which is not written into policy anywhere really is the whole issue of failure, and then you become an artist basically through persistence. We switched to reflecting, several of us remembering the Art and Working Life program in the early 90s at a very optimistic time under Whitlam, in which artists worked with people in factories and created artworks together, which evolved in part into the Melbourne Workers' Theatre and yielded people like Andrew Bevell and Patricia Cornelius. Now that died, of course, and which reminds us, of course, that the endless string of initiative kind of funding that's happened over decades often leads to these kind of disappearances. That's just a comment from me. And then we went on to, for some reason, we had Astrid present, that's right. Astrid was talking about where Julian prompted her to think about where she might go next. And she talked about, well, perhaps the couch thing might be done, but she still wants to go to where people are, and that's on their phone. They might not want to see a 2-hour show or something like that, but the phone is where they are, and she'd like to perhaps to work with a different generation of younger people who are not, say, in tune to Savage Garden, I suppose.
Yeah, could I add to that, Keith? She also made this very important point that people don't necessarily want to be just consuming art. They want the time to think, to reflect. That's also part of what she does.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then Larry countered with a punch, which was that this could become digital tech reliant, and in fact keep people apart. As Astrid said, well, live is good, but people are already on their phones. And Julian came in the notion of maintaining contrary ways of being. Like I assume that meant we have live and we have online. And I must say myself, I saw amazing work online during COVID, much of which I would like to see continued in some way and monetized permanently, because it was fantastic seeing productions from around Australia that I would never otherwise have seen. Just the last thing I'd mention is that Harriet raised the idea of the next crisis. What might that be and how that might shape us? As she suggested, a cyber attack.
Fantastic. Okay, that's great. We're getting much better at these fast summaries. Mark, did you want to take a couple of minutes just to see us out so we can stretch our legs, visit the bathroom?
Could I ask Mark a question, actually? Mark, I just wanted to ask if what a peak body might look like. Is it something that Currency House can contribute to?
Well, I mean, as I've always said, Currency House has been producing the green papers on all sorts of policy issues that the Australia Council used to do and should be a function of the bureaucracy in a functioning society. So Currency is already doing it to some extent. I have a great nervousness culturally about peak bodies in this country. The politicians want them. It was something we discussed in the Group 1 session. But at the same time, it is very difficult to accept particularly in these times of diversity, that there is going to be one neck that should be offered to each politician to chop off whenever it wants to, or for that matter, to elevate. And there has always been a nervousness in Australia, unlike the Irish model, where, you know, there is a college of whatever it is, about 400 of the artists who are a self-perpetuating group, but they are entitled to be treated as elders, if you like, of a society that does value its artists. So I've always had a nervousness about this. I certainly know senior bureaucrats who I've known many years who were very concerned that any national body would wind up being unrepresentative of need. And John, in our session, made a very good point about why he is now in Alice Springs, and the artist as ambassador into the community is a very, very attractive one, particularly in the way we are getting back in touch with First Nations peoples and minorities. It was the original model for the setup of the Victoria College of the Arts, of course, the drama school. Peter Oyston wanted to create shock troop companies that would go out and live off the land and bring grassroots culture. But look, just 3 quick points, and they are, if you like, me coming from the fact that everyone seems to be a Marxist this last couple of weeks, even our government. In a classical theory of Marxist theory, culture was superstructure. It was not, the economic base was the only thing that counted. And that led to this concept, of course, of mystification, and we see Brecht as a good socialist working with that and creating a fascinating art form from that deep distrust of mystification that it's associated with the arts, but also associated with a whole lot of other political processes that dominate other people. So this unease with dominant discourses is something that the artistic community has as part of its DNA, but it's also now part of the DNA of both sides of government. And finally, there's actually, both in classical Marxism and currently in certain streams, a great nervousness about eros. There is a huge concern about fun. Who's having it at whose expense? And so all of these things need to be overcome. I would love to create something that was inclusive, large enough and noisy enough to ensure that there was always a seat at the table for it. But that's going to take a lot of grassroots coordination, and currency, I think, is part of that. Doesn't have to lead it, or at least it doesn't have to say it's leading it, but this sort of activity, independent of the academy and the agendas that the academy is regrettably having to push, is something worth pursuing.
Thank you, Mark. Shall we have a 15-minute break?
Yeah. Hey, Max,
yeah.
Can I make a suggestion? Because we are at a certain point in the afternoon, and we've had, you know, cracker day and a half. In the next session, I was thinking that we could do it perhaps in a softer way. So this is just a suggestion. I've got a few pictures to show, really, rather than an argument to make. I know John and Alison will talk, you know, as part of that initial presentation. So I'll do my few pictures thing, which would be nice to look at, I hope. And then John and Alison will probably talk quite briefly, I would have thought.
And then just go to plenary and wrap up?
Yeah, I was thinking that. And then we can just, you know, we can, you know, play our age, as it were, you know, just because we can't all go for a drink. We might as well see out the afternoon in a smoother way.
Yes, we can drink alone together later, together alone. So listen, why don't we come back in 15? So it's 3:40. We come back at 3:55, and then we'll basically just sit in plenary for an hour being entertained and engaged by you. I hope that has, I hope people haven't minded me pushing the model. So.
No. It's been fantastic. John, is that okay with you if we do it that way?
Fine with me. I'm flexible.
Yeah, it doesn't cut down your airtime. It just
Harriet did say short.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's
happy to do
break
it, of course.
And
I'm very long.
Yeah.
Excellent.
back in 15.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
5-2.